Good morning, and thank you for allowing me to be here. It's an honor to be with you on this important issue. I do want to say about Mr. Green's concern that if either he or his staff had read the testimony, they would find on page 3 I describe my relationship as an advisor to the U.S. Consumer Coalition. But the subject of today's hearing is important in a narrow sense, in that we have an agency that is collecting more information about Americans' private lives than any bureaucracy deserves for reasons unrelated to national security. But it is also important in a broader sense. Today, the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau is so far outside the historic American system of constitutionally limited government and the rule of law that it is the perfect case study of the pathologies that infect our bureaucracies at the federal level. It is dictatorial, it is unaccountable, it is practically unrestrained and expanding on its already expansive mandate from Congress, and it is contemptuous of the rights, values, and preferences of ordinary Americans. The CFPB is all of these things, as are many of our large, destructive bureaucracies in this city, a huge problem in its own right. But the CFPB is an especially good symbol of these pathologies because of its unique structure among regulatory agencies. In the Dodd-Frank Wall Street Reform and Consumer Protection Act that created the Bureau, Congress, very unwisely in my opinion, gave up 2 of its core constitutional powers for reining in executive branch agencies. First, the CFPB is not subject to the annual congressional appropriations process, and instead is funded out of a fixed portion of the Federal Reserve's budget. So in effect, you have a bureaucratic slush fund that is self-defined by the bureaucracies on their behalf. Second, its director can be fired only by the president and then only under limited circumstances, because Dodd-Frank protects him from being removed by Congress. For all practical purposes, this means the bureaucracy is free to do whatever it wants within the broadest imaginable interpretation of its authority without fear of losing its funding or its leadership. This is a very dangerous recipe for petty dictatorship and is completely foreign to the American model. I always remind people, Lord Acton's famous dictum, power tends to corrupt. Absolute power corrupts absolutely. Notice he drops the tens. There's no better example of the corruption of power than this agency, which is totally secret, totally unaccountable, spending vast amount of money, having huge cost overruns, and doing whatever it wants to whoever it feels like doing it to. We know this formula is dangerous because we have watched the Bureau's behavior over the past 4 years. We have seen the contempt with which it treats Congress and the American people. The CFPB is prohibited from regulating car dealers, but it has done so anyway, using absurdly inaccurate techniques, which, by the way, in the private sector would lead to lawsuits over fraud, to accuse them of racial discrimination and extract fines from car companies and auto finance companies. This is your government as a bully, and it is your government as a blackmailer. The topic of this hearing is another good example of the CFPB's overreach, one I also discussed in my own article in the Wall Street Journal last summer. The CFPB is prohibited in Section 1022 of Dodd-Frank from collecting personally identifiable information on Americans. But the Bureau is doing so anyway, and it is doing so on a massive scale that rivals the NSA's most controversial collection programs, but for much less compelling reasons. The CFPB has said it aims to monitor at least 95% of all credit card transactions in the U.S. by 2016. Toward that end, the Bureau is already collecting and analyzing data from at least 600 million credit card accounts each month. That's 7 billion records in the last year alone. And it's not just credit card data. The CFPB is gathering data on 22 million private label mortgages every month, 5.5 million student loans, 2 million bank accounts with overdraft fees, and on hundreds of thousands of auto sales, credit scores, and deposit advance loans. These secretive and intrusive data gathering operations are taking place without consumers' knowledge and without the ability for consumers to opt out. Unless they have been tuned into occasional congressional oversight hearings like this one, consumers are entirely unaware that government bureaucrats are poring over their credit card transactions every month looking for new products to regulate. The CFPB is scooping up more information about law-abiding Americans than any government agency should be permitted to collect for reasons unrelated to national security or law enforcement. In fact, in a recent poll conducted by Zogby for the U.S. Consumer Coalition, which I happen to advise, let me repeat that since it's in the record, but I just want to make sure for particularly Mr. Green's staff that they get it, which I happen to advise, so I'm not secret about the relationship. Just 1 in 5 Americans said they believe the CFPB should be allowed to gather credit card statements without consumers' knowledge. For those of you who are concerned about the intelligence community's data collection effort, I don't see how you can be worried about the potential for abuse and about the, in fact, justified lack of transparency in national security agencies and not be concerned about the same dangers in this large and unaccountable bureaucracy armed with similar kinds of information. Think of the absurdity of being told that Homeland Security will not look at Facebook pages of foreigners out of concern for their privacy while CFPB is gathering up all of this data. Let me just say, certainly if the NSA and the FBI need a warrant to collect such data on U.S. citizens for the purpose of preventing terrorism, the CFPB should need to get a warrant too. In closing, what we have in the CFPB is an agency that is not accountable to Congress or the American people, an agency that is stretching the boundaries of its authority as far as it can, and a bureaucracy which for all practical purposes is out of control. As the American people's elected representatives in Congress, this should bother you no matter which side of the aisle you're on and whatever you think of the Bureau's preferred regulations. It is imperative that we move toward abolishing the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau and at the very least subject it to annual budgeting and appropriations process in addition to restructuring its leadership to make sure it is accountable to Congress. Thank you, and I look forward to your questions.